Germany had been reluctant to supply Ukraine with weapons, but this is its belated gift, presented in this promotional video. The significance of this anti-missile weaponry is not just its range, but what it now represents. Today, the conflict in Ukraine has entered a new phase. In Germany, NATO allies, galvanized by a perception of Russian weakness, are changing their tactics from defense to attack.
I applaud all the countries that have risen and are rising to meet this demand. But we don't have any time to waste. The briefings today laid out clearly why the coming weeks will be so crucial for Ukraine. So we've got to move at the speed of war. Thanks, guys.
A war the US believe is at a tipping point. Over 40 countries have gathered to unite behind a package providing new firepower, and after German hesitance, a shift in gears. But what does the acceleration of weapons and military aid mean for this war?
There's no question that the decision to supply heavy weapons to Ukraine is a new phase in this conflict. Until now, the main objective of Western governments and of the Ukrainian military was simply not to lose this war. Now, however, 2 months into the war, the strategy is shifting. The weapons that are being supplied are there in order to steel the Ukrainian military for a victory, a potential victory against the Russians.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, earlier the Russian foreign minister entertained the peace offering from the UN to mobilize a humanitarian effort in Mariupol.
I know that we have today, in facing the complex situation in Ukraine, different interpretations.
Different interpretations might be an understatement. If at times Russia sounded conciliatory, there were also aggressions. Last night the Russian foreign minister flirted with nuclear threats.
Когда действительно риски весьма и весьма существенные, очень не хотелось бы, чтобы эти риски искусственно раздувались, а желающих таких немало. Опасность серьезная, она реальна, ее нельзя недооценивать.
This is a Russian missile test. Today there was a warning for Britain that Russia would respond to provocation after the government announced support for Ukrainian strikes into Russia. But are these threats a sign of dissent or a country looking for a way out of the war? On a busy day of diplomacy, Putin was back at his long table with the UN Gutierrez, blaming Ukraine's actions but promising a political solution. Putin has been increasingly isolated. This is a party for returning athletes at a time Russian sportsmen and women had been disinvited from competitions across the world. Today's news increases the pressure. These are Ukrainian forces in Luhansk. On the ground, NATO feels the balance of power has shifted as the alliance is mobilized. Today, Sweden and Finland also confirmed plans to apply for membership, an ambition that persists in Ukraine. But would that be sacrificed in the pursuit of peace?
You can't think in the scale of don't anger the aggressor. Because thinking about compromising, it's sort of, oh, we shouldn't do something, we should do something to Putin, for Putin to be calm. Statements will not do anything. The only thing to stop Putin and to stop Russians is to win at the battlefield.
But on that field, the casualties are mounting. This is besieged Kyiv, resilient but in need of rescue. Thousands have died in this conflict, and as the UN projects that over 8 million will be made refugees this year, this is why today's diplomacy matters.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Armed Forces Minister James Heappey, and I asked him if Britain backs President Zelensky's clear position that Russia must be defeated and out of everywhere it has occupied since the war began in February, before any negotiations could begin over Donbass.
Absolutely. Our position is that it is for the Ukrainians to define what is an acceptable outcome for this. After all, this is their country, and they were living peacefully within their own borders. And then in February, 130,000 Russians rolled across and started to take their territory. And I just think the idea that the UK or any other country in the world can turn around to Zelensky and say, we advise you to cede the land that's been taken so far and sue for peace right now, that's not ours to take. The Ukrainians are a proud sovereign nation, and we should respect that sovereignty and support them in pursuing the outcome that they desire.
The Defence Secretary was asked this week whether he could see NATO forces, British forces, returning to Western Ukraine. And he entertained that idea. Because if the war is essentially in the east, we could go back to a situation where British forces are close to Lviv, for example. Do you see that happening?
Prior to February, I think what is sometimes forgotten is that there has been a conflict in the Donbass for 8 years or so. And, dozens of people on each side were dying each year as a consequence of that conflict. And yet the UK was heavily invested in training the Ukrainian armed forces in central and western Ukraine. It's perfectly feasible that we can return to that position in the near future.
Do you support any Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory? It's not clear whether these attacks on ammunition and arms facilities in Russia are Ukrainian, but if they are they justified?
Just as when I've been giving interviews previously and we've been talking about whether Russia might seek to blow up the resupplies that we're providing once they've crossed the Ukrainian border, well, of course they could. And that's a perfectly legitimate target because they're trying to disrupt Ukrainian supply lines. But by exactly the same token, whether they are or not is still unclear, but by exactly the same token, it's completely legitimate for the Ukrainians to be seeking to strike into Russia's depth in order to disrupt their fuel supplies and their logistic operations as well.
So if you accept that Ukraine has a right to hit military targets in Russia, and we are obviously sending them anti-tank missiles, for example, is there a principled difference between sending them those sorts of battlefield weapons and sending them long-range missiles?
No, I mean, increasingly we are sending them longer-range stuff because the nature of the conflicts has changed. The international appetite to provide military aid to Ukraine has changed. And I would encourage President Putin to observe that every time there has been that gear change in the international donor community, it has been in response to an outrage by the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. The international community has become further emboldened and felt an ever greater sense of responsibility to support Ukraine because of the atrocities the Russians have been committing. And at the heart of all of this is a resolve to allow the Ukrainians to stand up for their sovereignty and restore their territory.
And just on the other side, Lavrov, of course, again, raising the nuclear spectrum. Do you take them seriously when they say things like that?
No, I mean, I think that the risk of this becoming nuclear are vanishingly small. But I think what you've seen over the course of the last 3 months is that every time that Russia has been under pressure, every time that their military plan has started to stall, and or every time that the Western donor community has sought to kind of change gear and do more, Russia has rattled the nuclear saber. I think that, I think everybody, both in Moscow and in the West, is clear that a strategic exchange or even a tactical exchange of nuclear weapons is an escalation that is in nobody's interests. Just
finally, on the politics of all this, your colleague Tobias Ellwood, chairman of the Defence Select Committee, former military man as well, has said it's nonsense that you couldn't change Prime Minister because of what's going on in Ukraine, especially if this is turning into a more narrow conflict. Do you agree? Whatever you think of getting rid of Boris Johnson, do you accept that he is right to say you could quite easily change Prime Minister without fundamentally changing what Britain's doing in Ukraine?
So I actually don't think he's right. And he is right that there is historical precedent. But what is different is the rules of Conservative Party leadership elections. If the PM were to stop being the PM, there would then be a 3-month process in which we would elect a new party leader. And I don't think that in the middle of the cost of living challenge that we are going through and in the security situation that we are in, that would be a sensible thing to do at all.
James Heapy, thank you very much.
Thanks, Christian.
Well, let's go live now to our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, who is in Dnipro. Lindsay.
Christian, it was interesting what James Heapy was saying there, that the Western countries are supplying more weapons now because of the atrocities committed by the Russians. I don't think it's just because of that. I think it's because they scent victory. Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, said yesterday that what they wanted now was a weakened Russia that could never invade a country as it has invaded Ukraine. So we see the stages that the West has gone through. To begin with, they provided very few weapons because basically they thought the Ukrainians would just be rolled over and they didn't want their weapons to be taken by the Russians. Then they saw that the Ukrainians were able to resist the Russians, so they started to give them a bit more to help them do that, all those anti-tank weapons and so on. And now we've got to a phase where they think that the Ukrainians really can push back the Russians because they've pushed them back out of north of Kyiv. And also the Russians are showing that they're not able to reconstitute their units in the way that they had thought that they were going to. They've lost a lot of armor, they've lost a lot of men. And so that, I think, is why Western countries are pushing so hard now, piling in weapons to this country. But that, of course, has its own dangers.
It used to be a family home, like others in the village of Kamyanske, obliterated by Russian artillery. 3 people were killed by a Russian shell here at the weekend. Who would stay in such a dangerous place?
В основному вже тих, хто хотів виїхати, вони вже поїхали. Але залишилися все ж таки люди, яким немає куди їхати.
The colonel takes us further into the village. We're about 15 kilometers from the front line.
Hello, good morning.
Lena and Kyiv left in early March, but are bringing supplies to their neighbors who are helping others in the village.
У нас повністю згорів будинок. Це під час обстрілів. Зараз обстановка теж дуже напружена.
Their neighbor Vitaly calls over to them. So why hasn't he left?
Я буду здесь, я был здесь, я буду здесь. Я верующий человек, я христианин, я баптист.
The couple drive off to visit their ruined house. But then we hear incoming artillery. So we scramble back into the car and drive quickly to a less exposed position.
Чем быстрее, тем лучше.
A few minutes later, the couple arrive, also looking for safety, bringing Vitaly's wife with them.
Доброго здоров'я всім. Видно з окна глаз.
Kyiv shows me how he was injured when their house was hit in March. And there's worse. Lena's father was killed.
Мы были в доме в этот момент, когда нам на дом упала ракета, разбилась крыша. Папа был, получается, напротив этой ракеты и осколками пробило ему сердце. Маме пробило ноги, а моему мужу пробило тоже, кусок пятки отрезала. Сейчас он лучше всех уже восстановился, мама потихоньку ходит, а папу мы на следующий день похоронили. Через день, да.
Their lives are uncertain now, but at least they have each other. Now the shelling's over, they decide to return to the city, while we go back to see Vitaly. He takes us to Lena's parents' house, where their dog has nothing to guard but ruins.
My God.
The rocket came straight through the roof and into the kitchen, where it killed Leonid, Lena's father.
Wow.
A moment of destruction, frozen in time. Remnants of lives, normal lives, everyday lives. Leonard's wedding to Lena's mother years ago. A family home, destroyed in a war they could never have imagined.
This area has been shelled since the beginning of the war. It's extraordinary that anybody has stayed here at all. But many of the villagers say they've got nowhere else to go. The Russians are in the next village now. They could be here within days.
Opposite, signs of spring amongst abandoned houses.
Right, so it came in here.
Vitaly shows me how close the shelling came to his house, hitting another just a few yards away.
All these little bits of shrapnel and Yeah.
But he and his sister Svetlana say they're going nowhere. They've got animals to look after and older people in the community to care for. After all the evidence of Russian brutality in Bucha and elsewhere, are they not afraid of what will happen to them if the Russians occupy the village?
Не знаю даже, я как-то и не думала об этом. Я думаю, что как бы будет сегодня попадем под бомбежку или не попадем под бомбежку. А что дальше будет, то уже, как говорится, Бог усмотрит, что будет.
So they gather tulips while they may and hope for the best.
Well, Lindsay, where does the situation on the ground and all these new weapons going to Ukraine leave the UN Secretary-General's attempted peace?
I don't think there's a lot of hope at the moment. Negotiations normally happen when two sides have fought each other to a standstill, or where one side is so strong that it feels it can negotiate from a position of strength and the other side is just going to have to surrender. We're not at that point at the moment. But I think there is a danger of escalation. And some voices will be saying that the Americans and NATO are getting too confident, and that the danger is that if Putin feels cornered, he might use nuclear weapons, he might use weapons of mass destruction, and that would be even worse for Ukraine. Most Ukrainians I've met say, we fight on, we're going to defend our country. But as you saw in that report, there are a lot of victims in this war, and there are likely to be many more as well.